Well, here we are, still working our way through Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, the teaching that Jesus shared with his followers. As Graham said last week, the Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what is right. Jesus is talking to his followers about the life that we share with God. And he covers, as I'm sure you would agree, quite a lot of ground. He talks about prayer, he talks about fasting, he talks about family relationships, he talks about loving our enemies, he talks about almsgiving, he talks about divorce. He also talks about the thoughts that prompt our actions. The focus of today is placed specifically on our relationships. Jesus talks about anger and divorce. As Graham said last week, it's important to remember that Jesus valued the teachings of his people. He valued the law. The prophets were chosen by God to speak on God's behalf, and in a way Jesus is following in their footsteps. He valued the law. So like Moses, like Ezekiel, like Amos, Hosea, Micah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and numerous others, Jesus spoke as a prophet. He offered leadership to his followers, and he challenged those who would weaken God's message. So this was the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, to remind the people of the importance of the law, and also to help them understand it. In the words of our gospel last Sunday, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. So in our gospel today, Jesus talks about adultery and divorce. Fun stuff. It's an uncomfortable subject, especially for those of us who are divorced. Jesus begins with the law. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. He's quoting straight from the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 18. This is the law. No adultery. It's one of the 10 commandments. And under the law, this is enough, it seems. But for Jesus, it's not that simple. Jesus calls his followers to look within, to study their hidden motives, the thoughts and the desires that prompt their actions. He argues that those who look at a woman, or presumably a man, with lustful intentions are already at risk. That's what he's saying. Before the action comes the thought. Lustful thoughts are presented as the motivation for the action that sometimes follows. Adultery of the heart. That's what he's saying. So this is more than just a teaching about adultery. It's a teaching that encourages us to question our motives, the thoughts that prompt our actions, or sometimes our lack of action. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Jesus then talks about divorce. And again, he begins with the law. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. This is an interesting one, and I'm guessing that I'm going to see some of you cringe. According to the law, a newly married man in the first century has the absolute right to divorce his wife if she doesn't please him. That's taken straight from Deuteronomy. If she doesn't please him, or if he finds her objectionable in some way. That's the reading from Deuteronomy. That's what it says. God. Under the law, in the first century, the man is required to write the woman a certificate of divorce and then send her out of the house with nothing but the clothes on her back. That was the law.
Why did they change it?
Well, we're getting to that. So the teaching comes to us from the world of the first century, from Palestine, and it reminds us that the law serves God, but it was written by humans, it's a work in progress, and it's far from perfect. It reflects a rather primitive and patriarchal understanding of marriage within a tribal context, first century. It's important to remember that the very idea of marriage and a family evolved over many years, hundreds, thousands of years. And it's still evolving today. 2 generations ago, when a couple wanted to divorce, they went to a court. And a judge was called to determine the guilty party. My grandparents went through this. That was 2 generations ago. Today we understand that such matters aren't that simple. We don't have the guilty and the innocent in marriage. So the teachings of Jesus can be seen as an extension of this process, the ongoing evolution of the idea of marriage. Consider the words of the prophet Malachi, hundreds of years before Jesus was born. He argued that the Lord hates divorce and encourages the faithful to remain faithful in marriage. That's Malachi chapter 2. It goes further than the teachings of Deuteronomy. Malachi doesn't talk about the woman failing to please her husband. For Malachi, marriage is the joining together of 2 people under one faith, a symbol of unity under God. It's a step in the right direction, but not a perfect description of marriage by any means. But it's a step in the right direction. I'm reminded of the wisdom of Aristotle, who argues that divorce is a grave matter. In the words of Aristotle, divorce is to family what civil war is to the state. I can relate to that. And Jesus, I think, might have had some of these concerns in mind when he placed the limits on the conditions that allow for divorce. He restricts them to matters of infidelity. And he does this for a very obvious reason. In a culture with no social security for the disadvantaged or support for vulnerable women and their children, he argues that the powerful have a responsibility to the powerless. In this case, women. That's what he's saying. The powerful have a responsibility to the powerless. Jesus uses this teaching to remind the people that the law serves God's purpose. It was never intended to be used by the powerful to serve themselves, especially at the expense of the powerless and the vulnerable. That's what Jesus is saying. So again, this isn't really a teaching on marriage and divorce. It's a call to self-examination, a call to reject the self-serving abuse of power for selfish gain. That's what Jesus is saying. So this is the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, to offer clear, common sense guidance to the people. And Jesus covers a lot of ground. Again, he talks about prayer, he talks about fasting, he talks about family relationships and almsgiving and the attitudes that govern our actions. He reminds us that living under the law is not a burden, it's a privilege. It's a calling to live in a state of grace. So Jesus talks about the need for authentic prayer and generosity. He talks about responsible care for the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. And surely this is the same message that we receive from all of God's chosen people down through the centuries. We are called to live under this law in a state of grace. So today our reading calls us to think about our calling, our willingness to live under God's law, to let this law evolve and change over time, much like our understanding of marriage. And at the same time, there's also the possibility that we are being called to share God's word with other people, to speak out against those who would distort God's message of hope and love, those who use the letter of the law for selfish gain, those who neglect the poor and the needy along the way. The Lord be with you.